Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, viewers, wherever you may be. Columbia Global Centers, Nairobi, welcomes you to the launch of our webinar series on Africa and Africanity. This is a three-part series. Today's lecture is titled Identity and Equity in Africa, Religious and Ideological Perspectives. Please be sure to register for the consequent lectures, which are scheduled for November 6th and November 13th, respectively, at 5 p.m. Nairobi and 9 a.m. New York. This webinar will be recorded and can be accessed on our YouTube page as well as on our website under videos in the coming week. To ensure your safety, some features have been disabled, this being audio and video sharing as well as screen share. You're welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The speaker will answer your questions at the end of the session. For more engaging, intriguing, and educative programs, please subscribe to our mailing list by visiting our Contact Us page on our website, globalcenters.columbia.edu/Nairobi. I would now like to hand over to our director, Dr. Murugi Dirango.
Thank you, Pauline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience, and welcome. My name is Murugi Dirango, as Pauline has said. I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers in Nairobi. CGC Nairobi is one of 9 centers across the globe established by Columbia University to create opportunities for shared learning and to deepen the nature of global dialogue. Today, we are delighted to host, as Pauline has said, the first in a series of 3 lectures on Africa and Africanity to be delivered by Professor Jesse Mugambi, who is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. These lectures are organized in collaboration with the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, University of Nairobi, and Columbia University's Institute of African Studies. Today's lecture is titled Identity and Equity in Africa, Religious and Ideological Perspectives. The respondent to today's lecture will be Professor Mamadou Diop, the Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and Director of Columbia University's Institute of African Studies. I will now introduce Professor Mugambi. Professor Jesse Mugambi is an alumnus of the University of Nairobi and a member of academic staff since 1976 in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. On leave of absence, he taught at other universities, including Rice University in Texas as a visiting Mellon Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religion. He was also a guest professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. He was a visiting professor at Emmanuel College, Toronto, Canada, and visiting professor at the University of South Africa, Pretoria. He also served as director of Starehe Boys Center in Nairobi. Among other responsibilities, he has been a resource person for the All African Conference of Churches since 1974, World Student Christian Federation since 1974, and World Council of Churches since 1975. His professional training is in education and communication, and his academic specialization include philosophy, theology, and religious studies. At the University of Nairobi, he served as chair of the department between 1986 and 1990, associate dean, faculty of arts in 1990, academic registrar between 1990 and 1994. He has authored and co-authored several books and articles on philosophy and religion. His expanded bio can be found on our website. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mugambi. Karibu, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to join you in this very important event. I want to thank Columbia Global Center, Nairobi, for inviting me and also for facilitating this series of lectures. In particular, I thank the director of this center, and all the colleagues, especially Pauline Modoni, for facilitating this unique series. Thanks to all of you participants across the world. In spite of COVID-19, we are still researching and learning from one another. It is a great joy for me to lecture here in June 2019, and I'm delighted to come again, this time for a 3-lecture series. COVID-19 has been a great global challenge. From it, we have learned a great deal about ourselves. I'm looking forward to your responses. Before I move on to the lecture, I'd like to introduce Professor Karuri Mbogwa, who is the chair of our department and is my boss. He has been very supportive of this event, and I would like to ask Professor Karuri Mbogwa to now speak.
Thank you, Professor Mugambi. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking Columbia Global Center for inviting us to co-host this webinar as the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and also for inviting one of our own, Professor Mugambi, to give a talk. As you've been told, Professor Mugambi has been associated with the University of Nairobi since 1970. And you might wish to know that University of Nairobi is celebrating its 50 years since its inception this year. He was among the first cohort of students to be admitted to the university. And his professional career, as we've been told, started way back in 1976 with an appointment as a tutorial fellow in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, advancing to a full professor in 1993. As a scholar, Professor Mugambi is best known for his work in the area of African theology, and in particular, Reconstruction theology. And during his very long and illustrious career, he has taught very many students, mentored them, and they have gone on to make major contributions in their own right. Time may not allow us to exhaust all we have to share with each other, but I believe that this opportunity, this event, is a great opportunity to establish collaborations, networks, and partnerships. Asanteni sana. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karuri. So I've already given my thanks. I would like us to go straight to the remarks I have. The phrase Africa and Africanity Redefined is the title of a book by Professor Ali Mazrui, who was alumnus of Manchester University in 1960, where he did his first degree, Columbia University, where he did his master's in 1961, and of Nuffield College, Oxford in 1966, where he got his PhD. In 1988, Mazrui delivered a series of lectures at Columbia University, published under the theme Africanity Redefined. One of the spin-offs of the lectures is his book and film, now on YouTube, titled The Africans, A Triple Heritage. The publication was first with Africa World Press, but it's also an edition that was published by the BBC. The word Africanity sounds unusual, but Christianity sounds normal. Some Africans are both African and Christian. The adjective Christian is variously defined, depending on who defines it. Likewise, both the noun Africa and the adjective African are variously defined. Every definition is based on presuppositions. For centuries, Africans have been labeled by others, and underlying those definitions is the principle of objectification, in which Africa and Africans are viewed as objects for exploitation, conquest, and ridicule. There are periods in history, however, when Africans defined themselves. And in those periods, the visitors came to Africa for refuge, for learning, for business, and other purposes, positive ones. This particular lecture focuses on Africa as actor and author of history, not as an object or as one object by bystanders. You're welcome to verify all the facts in the public domain. Everything that I have prepared for this lecture are actually available online, but I haven't seen a combination such as that which I offer in this lecture. There's a great deal of difference between equity and equality. Equality presupposes congruence in all features. Production of identical communities is possible only in automated industrial manufacture. Normal humans are not robots. Each person is distinct from others. Even identical twins, triplets, and quadruplets, all those are different. Differentiation is essential for human identity. At the same time, equity is also essential for personal integrity. When labels become preferable to personalized reference, then there is danger because both the labeler and the labeled are marginalized and offended. Now to talk a little about human identity in the global and contextual perspectives. The biological species called Homo sapiens has one main common feature, sapiens. In the dictionary, sapiens refers to good taste, good sense, intelligence, or in another word, wisdom. Latest findings indicate that Homo sapiens occupied this trait, sapiens, intelligence, in tropical Africa, where the ecological conditions were ideal. We, all human beings, Homo sapiens, are relatives. The National Geographic magazine, the issue of July 2012, reports on population migrations originating from tropical Africa northwards along the Nile Valley 130,000 years ago. After the Isthmus of Suez, where the Red Sea meets the Mediterranean Sea, one migration ventured northwards into present-day Europe. Another ventured northeastwards, and at the Bering Strait, they entered Alaska, and then southwards into North America. At the Isthmus of Panama, they entered South America, and they kept on moving southwards with the most recent settlement of Homo sapiens in Argentina, reaching there most recently about 13,000 years ago. Another migration went across the Indian Ocean far southeastwards as far as Australia. The transatlantic migrations from Europe and Africa to the Americas are very recent additions to movements across time and space. Migrations from Asia to Africa have also added the complexity. In the end, however, these migrations are only scenes in a drama lasting for millennia. This drawing, this map, comes from that issue I referred to in the National Geographic magazine of July 2012. It shows just what I've described in words, with showing that the Homo sapiens actually became that in tropical Africa. And that explains why, because it is in this area where the conditions were right. Let me just venture at risk, and I can be corrected. as a theologian, because the Bible talks about the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve and those first lot of created people were living without clothes and without any way of knowing how to cook. They did not starve, and they did not die of cold. There are very few places on this planet where this was possible. Could it have been perhaps that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in the Congo? I don't know, but that's some food for thought. But anyway, the movement went as I have described, and it shows all the way up to the Bering Strait, where they crossed to Alaska, southwards, or all the way to South America. And this other wing to Australia, as the map shows. This same drawing from another perspective illustrates the same story, with the origin again showing origination in tropical Africa. And this map even shows that there was one wing that migrated to Southern Africa, and this is borne out by the archaeological findings. Genetic archaeology reminds us that we, all humans, are relatives. Here in Africa, within the equatorial belt, we stabilized our capacity of thinking and planning. The most ancient Homo sapiens remains have been found mostly in Kenya. Louis Leakey and Richard Leakey have taught us very much about our history as humans. The oldest complete skeleton of a human being was, if I can use the word, a gentleman, found near Lake Turkana, near the same place where even more recently, the oldest cemetery looking close to modern cemeteries has been found. The migrations are multi-directional, where they were multi-directional, northwards, northwestwards, northeastwards, even westwards, as I have described. There was free movement with also returning sometimes. The inhumane slave trade between 1440 and 1808 shipped more than 12 million Africans to the Americas. The recent wave of migrant workers from Africa to Europe and North America has further dispersed Africans to the north and the west. Again, the emphasis is clear. We are relatives. Now I want to refer to another aspect in our discussion. Much has been written and debated about the migrations across the Atlantic, both north and south. And we have referred to the slave trade as one of the most atrocious way of treating human beings. There's another link and movement that is not very well known, and that was the movement from China to East Africa. The information is online on the internet for those who are interested. But it happens that this I have had to learn. I did not learn in primary school, in high school, or even at the university. I have had to discover that myself, that the Chinese actually arrived on the east coast of Africa nearly a century before Vasco da Gama. By 1420s, Admiral Zheng He, with a fleet of 50,000 and a fleet of a large number of ships, came all the way from China, and they came dishing out gifts and winning friends across the Indian Ocean, and they came as far south as present-day Malindi. This is knowledge that we need to share among ourselves, because the story that has been told has been very much a relationship between Africans and the Europeans and those who migrated to the Americas. There's another story which still will need to be told. And our relationship with Asia is just as fruitful and interesting and worthwhile as that which we have had with the North and the West. This is another map of Admiral Hayes' movements. He actually was a very, very experienced adventurer, and he had a lot of support from the leadership in China. I now have a different kind of illustration, and I want to comment briefly about this drawing. Humans are distinct from the other primates, and that distinction is largely because of the capacity of human beings to make culture. My definition of culture is what humans do to ensure that the future will be different from the past. I have not said that it will be better, because sometimes humans have organized their culture in such a way that the future became worse than the past. That is what we have done with the 2 world wars that have come, and risk making the same mistake again if we are not careful. But every culture has these aspects or pillars which are interrelated but can be analyzed distinctly. The first of these, one might say, but one can begin anywhere, is polity, where power relations are organized. And this is to say that humans have that capacity, but the models that they use for organizing their polity, their sharing of social influence, differs from culture to culture, and within the same culture from time to time, as we are realizing even in our politics in Kenya today. The other is economy, which has to do with our distribution and management of resources. Ecology, which has to do with how humans organize or disorganize their ecology, their environment. Family, which has to do with rules and regulations as to how humans will relate with each other, who will marry who or who will not do, how the in-laws and non-in-laws are going to relate to themselves, and so on. Morality, which has to do with regulation of conduct. Beauty, which has to do with the sense of proportion. And as they say, sometimes beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. Where some people see proportion, others see disorder. Art, which has to do with what we do with our senses to express our appreciation. And religion, which has to do with our response in answer to ultimate questions. The question of ultimate origin, where we all came from, where everything has originated, ultimate purpose, why we are here. I mean, we are here for this lecture. Ultimately, why are we here? And ultimate destiny, where is everything ending? Now, coming back to this core, every human community has all these ingredients, but they are organized differently from culture to culture. And they are organized also differently from one historical period of a culture to another. All these aspects are what has distinguished Homo sapiens from others. And from the evidence the researchers have found, all this is oldest in our continent, not far from where we are as I deliver this lecture. I now want to go to our contemporary situation and the recent history. When you look at this map of Africa, the boundaries indicated are imperial boundaries, which have been inherited by in our republican status in the continent. What is important and interesting for us for a discussion like this is that these boundaries, when the imperial powers drew them, had absolutely no consideration of how Africans organize themselves. So we find situations in which many peoples are sometimes in more than one country. And each of those countries have different systems because they are imperial regimes of the past. And this is the awkward situation that Africa finds itself in, unlike anywhere else on the continent. When you look at the political map of Europe, the boundaries follow very closely ethnic demarcations. That is not so for Africa. Neither do these boundaries recognize the ecological zones of Africa. So if you think of the Sahara Desert, which is bordered by the equatorial forest and the temperate zone, that area which is a desert, the desert itself is shared by many of the nations. It is for this reason that it is really not wise for anyone to refer to any part of Africa as sub-Sahara Africa, as if Sahara is bigger than the continent of Africa. With a tongue in the cheek, as a joke, I've said, anybody who says that I come from sub-Sahara Africa, I shall say they come from sub-tundra Europe. If the tropical desert is so important for defining people, then of course the Arctic desert can also be used for defining people. So in that case then, Europeans come from sub-tundra Europe, and some Africans come from sub-Sahara Africa. It doesn't sound nice because it is wrong to define people by a subset of their own territory, their own country. And now I want to come to closer home. This is the map of Kenya, and the way it has been drawn is a reflection of the way the settlement patterns in this country. Between 80 and 90% of Kenya is arid or semi-arid, and the most fertile area is this part here. However, this whole country of Kenya, in spite of the semi-arid and arid areas, and except the coastal zone, is for practical purposes not very densely populated because of the difficulty of living there. But that does not mean that Kenya is badly off, because even in those places which are not forested, there are many other resources that can be used and are being used. But the density of the population in Kenya now, more than 50 million people actually reside in this area, which is well watered, well served with rain and rivers. The coastal region also is well served because of the rivers that drain there. So vegetation and habitation are closely related. And it's only humans who have been able to live in those places where they are able to modify the environment in order to live. Otherwise, areas which are arid and semi-arid have fewer people living there. I have also this map, which is interesting. It compares areas, national territories, to the continent of Africa. The whole of China, the whole of USA, the whole of the European Union, the whole of India, the whole of Eastern Europe, all those countries can fit into Africa, and there'll still be some place for some Africans to live. That's how big Africa is. But when you look at the maps, it doesn't show how big the continent is. The implication of this is that there's great potential for our continent. But too often we have neglected to appreciate this gift that we have here, particularly because of the kind of ideologies we get from outside. This map is showing the imperial partition of Africa. The green with the French, the yellow with the Italians, the purple, light purple was independent. On orange, near orange with the Portuguese. The red is where the British were, and the green is where the French were. And Africans did not have a say in this kind of demarcation. Now, what is the implication of this for the discussion we are having? The implication is that really, if we continue dwelling on this past, we are not going to serve ourselves very well, because these boundaries were made for the interest of others. This is the Murdoch map. Murdoch is the one who drew it, and he was trying to compare all those remarks I've been making with the straight boundaries, black lines, as the national boundaries of the imperial powers, and the other dots here and there of the ethnic communities of the Africans. It looks messy. It looks almost like a child's play. But that is our history, which ought not to delay us from moving towards the future. Now, this is an interesting map when we think about the subject of today. This is the language map in terms of language families, not in terms of ethnic dialects. And if, for example, we were to follow the norms of Europe, where every nation is basically a dialect place, not a language place, we would have probably just 6 states, if the language families were anything to go by. The yellow for Nilo-Saharan, blue for Afro-Asiatic, red for Niger-Congo A, orange for Niger-Congo B. These 2 languages are related all the way from West Africa to the East Coast. Khoisan in Southern Africa in green, and a small community which linguists have called Afro-Nation. I cannot understand why we should be having so many states if we were to follow the norm of the Europeans. Actually, to be easier for us, instead of increasing the number of states, we would be reducing them. We probably would be having only 6 states. That would be easier for us. Applying the same to Kenya, we now are having 47 counties, we call them. But again, if we're to follow the same logic, we would end up actually with 5 or 6 streets. These are the language groups. And for those who are Kenyans, we know that the debate is on about building bridges initiative. I would say, if I were asked for an opinion, for a comment, I would say we would have BBI, but it will not be building bridges, but breaking barriers. It will be BBI, but a breaking barriers initiative. But that's for us Kenyans, not for everybody to consume. We proceed now with the languages, and you can see how messy Africa has been with all these states having combinations of languages. And what is happening now in the African Union, and that's where I'll be before long ending, is to suggest that Africa is in its celebration of 50 years has recommended that we consolidate ourselves rather than fight among ourselves. And hopefully by 2063, Africa will be more cohesive than it has been in the past. Come to religion now, and you see what has happened. Again, Islam, Christianity, and various brands of Christianity and African religion have been distributed unevenly, but invariably, it is it's labeled here as indigenous, I would say traditional religion, which is permeating in the whole continent. But one of the dividing and competitive issues in Africa is when religions fighting against each other and denominations as sects within the continent are fighting. Now I want to refer to this map, and all these are online. I would recommend that when you have the time, you look at them. This is the conflict map of Africa. I would like to draw your attention specifically to East Africa, where my cursor is. And it is very interesting when you look at it. This is Kenya here. This is the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania. Across this boundary, we have 10 communities, language groups, from the coast to Lake Victoria. On the Tanzanian side, there is no conflict. But on the Kenya side, there's a lot of conflict. The question we ask ourselves is, what is it that the Tanzanians are doing right so that they have no conflict, and on the Kenya side, there is conflict? It means there is something that we have to work on for ourselves if we are going to reduce conflict within and across nations. For the Tanzanians, they did something for themselves. We are not in conflict with Tanzania, but then on the Tanzania side, they've been able to put their house in order. We have to put ours in order as well. And that could be seen across Africa along the lines that I'm discussing. Is there any hope? Yes, I think there is hope. And the hope lies, in my view, in consolidating our identity as Africans along the lines from where we started, which is to say that rather than emphasize our differences, we ought to be emphasizing our similarities, our commonalities. And by the same token, considering that we Homo sapiens basically are the same people who originated from here, there is no good reason, there is no good excuse at all why we ought to be fighting against each other and emphasizing our differences when we should be emphasizing our commonalities. The future is bright if we emphasize what we have in common, but it is very grim if we overemphasize our differences. One of the ways of doing that, and which is a sign of hope, is to emphasize what the African Union has tried to do, to take as a beginning Kiswahili, which is really not a language of any one community, as one of the languages of the African Union. The interesting thing is that when it was introduced, and not long ago, the first speaker, the first person who said he wanted to use Kiswahili in a meeting of the African Union was not an East African. It was Joachim Chissano from Mozambique. And the interpreters were not in the booth. They had to be called because he wanted to speak Kiswahili. When Nkrumah was head of state in Ghana, he also insisted on teaching Kiswahili. And Ghana was among the first countries to teach Kiswahili long before even the African Union made this response. I think that there are initiatives that we can take so that we stop emphasizing our differences when we should be emphasizing our commonalities. I have a feeling that we have been not fairly treated by those who have wanted to emphasize how different we are, when in fact we have a great deal in common across the continent. And I think we have also served ourselves and shortchanged ourselves even when we emphasize our racial differences, when in fact at the bottom we are, if I may say so, Africans. After all, we learn to be human on this continent. So there is a common agenda in the African Union. beginning from 2013, Agenda 2063, with 7 aspirations. And one of the most important aspirations, in my understanding, is aspiration number 5, a continent proud of its culture and its identity, and prepared to use it for consolidation of the continent. We need one common market. We need a passport, one passport. It's on the way. One people with many perspectives, one people with diverse creativity, one people in one continent, one people with one destiny. And we would want to share that with the rest of the world. Aspiration number 5 of the agenda we want is an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, and shared values and ethos. Pan-Africanism, so that we view ourselves with a people with a common history, a common destiny, a common identity, a common heritage, respect for religious diversity and consciousness, and also African peoples and the diaspora will all be entrenched. I would like to come to an end now and suggest that when we think of this question of Africa and Africanity, we are talking about what we have in common in the continent, not what we have in difference. Empires wanted to divide and rule. We have to think differently and in the opposite way for the future of our generations. I want to whet your appetite, for those of you who have not come across these readings, to some of those readings that I found very useful. One of those is by Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond has been professor of population geography at the University of California. He comes from the state of Montana, which, when he was a child, was the breadbasket of the United States, although it's in the Northwest. He says in the book that now Montana is a tourist attraction because it is desolate because of the abuse of the land. But his book talks about how societies choose to fail or succeed. And the recipe for failure is doing contrary to the suggestions that I've been making here. I refer you also to a little book that I wrote several years ago, Theologies of Liberation and Reconstruction, which perhaps you might find useful. And I think that suffices for now. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've kept within my time. Bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugambi. I'm sure our audience have enjoyed the talk as much as I have. And I was just thinking, as you are talking about the African Union and languages and so on, that in the future, probably we'll get to have you deliver this lecture in one African language, like Kiswahili, in the future. Brings to mind what happened recently with Professor Nguge wa Thiong'o, accepting the Catalonia Award for 2019. And he received the award and gave his speech in his mother tongue, which is Kikuyu. So I think we're making good progress. So let me ask our audience to continue, please, putting in your questions either in the Q&A or the chat box so that we can address them at the end of the next segment. Let me now introduce our respondent, Professor Mamadou Diop. Professor Diop is the Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and the Director of Columbia University's Institute for African Studies. He holds a PhD from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. Before joining the faculty at Columbia University, he was the Charles D. Moody Jr. Collegiate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Michigan from 2000 to 2007. Before that, he was head of Research, Information and Documentation, Department of the Council of the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and faculty member of the History Department of Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. His research interests include urban, political, social, and intellectual history in colonial and post-colonial Africa. He has published several books and articles. Professor Diop is a member of the editorial board of several professional journals, including the Journal of African History, Cambridge, Public Culture, and a co-editor of the book series, Histories of the South, published by Catra, Paris, and New National Histories in Africa, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Please visit our website for his full bio. Welcome, Professor Diop.
Thank you very much. I would like, before reacting to the excellent presentation of Professor Mugambi, to thank the Nairobi Columbia Global Center for putting together this event and for inviting me to contribute. What I would like to do very quickly, and it's really a reaction to the presentation, is first to underline the fact that I'm coming exactly from the other side of Africa. I am a West African. And this is important to keep in mind in my reaction for probably 3 reasons. Professor Mugambi one of them, he had insisted on discussing African borders, and based on the discussion of geography, trying to figure out what are the conflict and the problems we are facing on one hand, and on the other, what kind of solution can we devise to address those challenges. So I am a West African. I am coming from a part of Africa which is dominated by Islam, not by Christianity or African traditional religion. I am coming also from a part of Africa which colonial language is French. And the discussion about Christianity, in particular in this case, Catholicism, is very different compared to East Africa. And the third aspect, which is important, and Professor Mugambi has talked about, contrasting, if you want, the world which is called the Atlantic world, which is the dominant political economy today, to what he mentions has, I will come back to it very quickly, has a Chinese presence or contact with Africa in the 14th, 15th century. So I am coming from the Atlantic, where I can say very rapidly, Professor Mugambi is coming from a world which is considered, he did not mention that, he talks about China, but the heart of that world is the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is very important in this discussion about the identity of the continent. Is it an identity deriving from the political economy, which is still today the dominant political economy, the political economy of the Atlantic? Or is it, at least our hope, as he called it, will be a coal which is deriving its resources from the world of the Indian Ocean? You know, as a historian, the contrast we are making between the two, if you want, is a contrast between an Atlantic world, which is considered as a system, and an Indian Ocean world, which is considered as an arena. A system is based on hierarchy and actually master narrative. an arena is based on multiple horizons, on the juxtaposition of multiple horizon and multiple difference. And this allows me, if you want, to respond, not point by point, but to select issues which seems to me important issues, and based on which we can engage a discussion. Professor Mugambi opened his presentation talking about naming and the way in which Africans have been, if you want, located in the epistemological territory in which, you know, discussions, ethnographic discussion has been conducted. And one reference he made is the reference to Mazrui. I think that this is an important question to address. It is about identifying the conceptual libraries based on which Africans are described. African are present in, if you want, in a world knowledge production map. They define themselves, but they are also defined. In particular, you have three important libraries: is the Arab, the European, but you have also the African. And this is important to pay attention. When we talk about the naming of African, we pay usually more attention to the external view. We don't know very well how Africans are dealing with themselves and with their neighbors. I give an example. You know, the culture I'm coming from in Senegal, the Wolof, they define the non-Wolof in a kind of very strange way. They say they are the people who are speaking a language. And I'm literally translating. They speak another language, which means that their language is the only, is even not a language. It is the abstract, the essence of what is a language. I think this is a very important. The second element which is important is also how African Americans have not only discussed the naming, but have also influenced the way we understand ourselves. You know, and this is also important, and how the term African has become African. It was not. At what time the name became that? But because even in the Western language, if you take, you know, ancient Greek, the ancient Greek literature were Ethiopians. So how it is changing, and how the Ethiopians at a point who were Abyssinian became Ethiopian is also, these changes are very important. I'm insisting on that because where Professor Murambi referred to Mazrui, I will begin a discussion like this, referring to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi's book in particular, Something Torn and New, An African Renaissance, which was published in 2009, where he does exactly what you do in a different way, asking the question of the dismembering of Africa and its remembering, how to, what you call the hope. So that trajectory could be very interesting because he's trying to deal with the condition under which an African Renaissance is possible. And when you were talking, I was thinking about a book I discovered recently, which is a book by an African-American woman who published it in 1903. And it's called Of One Blood. Her name is Pauline Hopkins. And you see, of one blood covers your whole discussion about the Homo sapiens, is what she's saying, that we are all coming from the same ancestor. So you see how, and I really appreciate that, you know, your discussion and your engagement with the sapienization of the human for a philosopher and a theologian. This is usually, even historians sometimes are not into discussing that. It's too complicated. So they prefer to be, but it is important. And what I have learned with Hopkins is precisely that. And the other thing which is interesting is she shifts from the Homo sapiens to the Ethiopian. She is not dealing with Egypt, which was the center of the African-American discussion about the identity of Black and the quality of Africa, of Black cultures of civilization. She talks about Ethiopia. And I also appreciated very well how, you know, from your prehistorical discussion, you engage with a more philosophical discussion about equity versus equality. And I think it's important, but it's important about your solutions and about how to understand African societies today and how to project them in a future of peace, a future of stability, and a future of development. And I think the notion of equity, and you know, you will see why it's important that I insist on that, is showing something in African societies, which is not necessarily debated by philosophers when they are making this comparison, you know, about you know, ethics and morality between Africa and you know, Africa and the West, between societies which are individually centered and societies which are community-centered. You know, it's the whole discussion, you know better than me, of Father Wang, of Wiredu, but of yourself also, etc., etc. But what I'm interested in is the importance of something you have insisted on, is the importance of difference. That African pre-colonial societies are organized based on recognizing difference, not unity. I will come back to that to discuss your conclusion, which means that they created polities. I'm coming back to a notion you used. They are building polities based on communities pulled together, but recognizing their difference. It's why, you know, today historians are saying those communities, those polities are based on a kind of technology of clustering based on productive difference, based on different specialization, but imposing collaboration. Imposing, if you want, cooperation. But those community clusters are not organized based on a strict hierarchy. They are based on what archaeologists are calling a hierarchy. Their organization are horizontal, not vertical. And I think that this is very important to our discussion. And this discussion could be open again in the comparison between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. And I also appreciated your discussion about China, though we have, you know, a kind of completely different appreciation, if you want, of why China, which connected with Africa before the European. but in a system which is, as I said, an Indian Ocean system. Why after Admiral Z's travels, the Chinese decided to stop participating in the globalization adventure. They decided themselves. They destroyed everything because they wanted to expand West. They wanted to expand and create this huge empire. So it's important also to see how different horizons are perceived and worked through. So this is also, I think, an interesting discussion. But this failed globalization, what is interesting is one of the first attempts of the South globalization with the attempt of the first African and Asian independent countries to create what was called the Afro-Asian network, you know, with the Bandung Conference. So we can see a kind of continuity and discontinuity, which is interesting. About the geography, about the borders, etc., I agree with you, and I'm again back to this idea. Even, you know, I think theologians has shown that the borders are not important. What is important are the communities and the network. And historians agree that African polities have never defined themselves as spaces, has physical geographies. They identify the communities which are part of the polity, but they don't define geographical limit of their sovereignty. Here again, the notion of sovereignty should be looked at in a different way. And if we pay attention to those questions, just after World War II, the discussion about, you know, among African political leaders and intellectuals is a discussion, in particular in West Africa, about the geographical scope of these colonial territories, which kind of polity to destroy. And if you take the two Senegalese political leaders, Senghor and Mamadou Dia, Senghor has forged a concept which is called balkanization. In the history of Europe, balkanization is a positive process with the emergence of nationalities becoming state nation. Senghor considered that is a bad thing in Africa because what we need is to reunite this fragment of territories which were created by colonialism. And his prime minister, Mamadou Dia, has published a book in '61, which is called The African Nation and World Solidarity, where he's again engaging with that. So I think this is also important, that this debate existed. And the debate about African unity has begun since the 60s. I am not a fan of the African unity. You know, I think that they have been doing a very bad job since their creation. So, and I understand your positivity with Agenda 2063. I'm probably more reluctant than you. So I would like to finish just there and conclude on what you call the hope. To just very quickly tell you the, you know, space in which we could have a very interesting discussion. When you talk about identity, I always talk about identity, one in the plural. We don't have one identity. And identity is much more of a product of processes of identification. And it's very strategic. I can tell you, based on my name, you know that, you know, I'm Muslim. So I have supposedly a Muslim identity. I was trained in France And, and I was born in a colonial city. Part of my identity is also very colonial. I'm more cosmopolitan than many Senegalese of my generation because of many things. So I can use these, worldly whatever. I live in this country, and for my African American colleague, I am Black, I am African, but sometimes they say, which is very funny, that I am a Black French. So these are very interesting things we have to pay attention. Pluralizing enables us to avoid the idea that we have to imagine national communities as the European. I'm referring to Ben Anderson's book, Imagine Communities, which have a way in which national communities are imagined. So I have and the aspiration 5 you mentioned, the notion of unity. I believe that we cannot build unity without going back to our history, and that history is a history of difference, is recognizing difference. Because recognizing difference allows us to accept the plurality of our society and to negotiate. I'm back to clusters. And probably, again, I think that is the only way to not only be present in the world, but to be able also to engage in a process of de-Westernization, which is not necessarily refusing the West, but a process of de-orientalization. And if you take, I'm sure you know it, the discussion among Catholic intellectual, Francophone Catholic intellectual in West Africa in the late 50s, early 60s, their discussion is about the only way to return the Catholic Church to its universal ambition is to disconnect the church from the Western cultural legacy. And they are the one who pushed for the convening of the Council, Vatican II, by Pope John the 23rd and Paul VI. And what is interesting is the leader of that movement, who is a Senegalese, was a converted person. His father was a Muslim cleric, and he was educated in a Muslim, but converted in France. So what I'm saying is that probably our celebration of unity should be also a celebration of difference. And that celebration could allow us, and I agree, and this is the hope, to reinvent Africa as, Googie is inviting us to do, to pull together what she called the two halves of Africa, the continent and its diaspora. So again, thank you very much for a very rich presentation, which allows me to engage in a discussion with you, where we agree and where we have a different take on different things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Diop. That was a wonderful discussion and, answer to the lecture of Professor Mugambi. As you can see, we have a lot of Q&A questions in the Q&A box, and Professor Mugambi and Professor Diop, I'm sure you're looking at some of those questions. Before we go to that, let me just acknowledge that in our audience, we have one of the advisory board members for the Columbia Global Center in Nairobi, Dr. Manu Chandaria. And he sends his regards to you, Professor Mugambi. He says he's the founder chair of Starehe Girls, and you are Starehe Boys. So we are very delighted he's here with us. Let me start off by, and I'm sure you can look through the Q&A and see some of the questions and maybe select some that you'd want to answer. But let me throw one out that has come from a person who is not named here, anonymous, who asks, is there anything that can be done for Africans to decolonize their minds, because we seem to have to be very colonized in our minds? Dr. Mugambi, would you like to maybe respond to Dr. Diop, Professor Diop, as well as answer that question? Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Professor Diop, for your response. I very much appreciate it. I think that now that we know each other, we're going to continue engaging. But let me summarize it in this way. There is very often a confusion in the English language and maybe in French when the word unity and union are used interchangeably. Unity should not be confused with uniformity. And very often when the word unity or union is used, most people understand it to mean uniformity. The problem is that human beings, even when they are identical twins, they revolt against uniformity, because it is part of being human that individuality is respected. I think that one of the perhaps insight we can learn from Tanzania, which is the neighbor of Kenya, is that although Tanzania is a very politically united nation, they have not abolished the identity, the traditional identity of the people. And it seems to me that it is in the recognition of difference, honorable respect for difference, that real unity and union can be achieved. But too often, politicians and businessmen mistake unity for uniformity. And they want to wish that all the people the same way, that they act in the same way, they follow the same routine. And when that happens, that is the beginning of trouble. Because human beings resist being co-opted or being marginalized or being undercut by others. So I think that the point you make is important as a caution to the new effort in African Union, that the new African Union does not go in the direction of trying to establish uniformity across the continent. And that also that same concern is taken very seriously, even within the African nations themselves, because the abolition of difference is actually the abolition of human dignity. So for me, it's of absolute importance that human dignity is not collectivized. That's why I refer to the identity of twins. The twins are even when they're identical, they are separate beings, and they are happiest when their individuality is respected. Now, commenting about our past, me coming from a British crown colony, not from a protectorate, and having been taught, beaten actually, punished for not speaking English, I learned to use the language, but I hardly ever use it as soon as I come from school and as soon as I come from the office. And these are the double identities that we live, that we have to come to terms with. I think it is in these differences, when they are taken seriously, that we can find a solution to our challenge. Let me comment about Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi is one of my mentors. He taught me at the University of Nairobi. And I read some of his manuscripts before they were published. I was privileged for that he would do that, just to ask me how I would respond to some of his works. And for him to have been honored in Catalonia because of his stand is an indication of the direction that we should move to. I do not personally think that continuing with the European languages and European norms and values at the neglect of our own, that it is an advantage. I think it's likely to be a disadvantage. What I think should happen is to recognize our individuality and bring that individuality to bear towards a broader self-understanding and self-consciousness. And I think those nations that have been successful are the ones that have recognized individuality, but brought that individuality to recognition at the national level. We are still struggling with that in Kenya, and I hope that the solution that we're going to get is not going to be towards uniformity, but towards the recognition of individuality in collectivity. Manu Chandaria, thank you very much for that recognition. We have been building our nation together, and I would like to thank you very much for all that support that you have given Starehe and others. And you will be remembered for making your contribution in history.
And I think Dr. Manu Chandaria had raised his hand. So Pauline, if you could connect Dr. Chandaria.
Thank you very much. I think it's very, very interesting, knowing him so well, but not knowing what he presented today. My idea, my thinking is that for every high school in Africa and every university in Africa must have this particular knowledge of what we are at the end of the day. What is our contribution and what we have been able to do. The people don't understand that. Nothing can interpret how we can propagate. And congratulations once again, Professor, that the way you presented it and the way you've been able to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Chandaria. I would like, Professor Diop, Professor Mugambi, if you've seen any questions that you'd like to address in the Q&A, I see one here that Professor Diop, maybe you can respond. It's asking how to achieve universalness, oneness in Africa. How do we do this in Africa? More often than not, we have a lot of divisions, a lot of civil war across the continent. How will Africa really, truly be united, if that's possible at all?
I think the answer is in many of the answers already exist. We have been repeating things for more than half a century, but we are not acting on the decisions we are making, one. And this is very important to keep in mind. Why are we coming up with resolution after resolution? And we are sometimes not only doing anything, but doing exactly the reverse. The second element, which is very, very important, is we are trying to find solution to our problem, not referring to our history, but borrowing solution from somewhere else. And it's not working because we are not what it shows. And this is the third problem, is we have always solution. But when you ask people what is the problem, they are unable to tell you what is the problem. Coming up with solution when you don't have a problem is something easy. And it's what we have been doing. And again, I'm back what makes us probably the genius of Africans have been throughout history since the period he talked about. The apparition of the Homo in this part of the world to the Homo sapiens was to adapt. One French paleontologist say that the emergence of the sapiens is just based, the difference between primate and sapiens is the Rift Valley and the creation of two ecological zones. So adapting has been our genius. And I think African has been great at that. I'm sure that, I don't know if Professor Mugambi will agree with me. I think the field where African were the most creative was to reinvent Islam and Christianity for their own. This is where they were great. The problem is we have to go back to our greatness, but based on our history and based on societies, and sometimes it's, terrible for someone like me coming from an Islamic tradition. I think paganism is the ideology based on which we created mechanisms to work out our difference and respecting our difference. And we have run away from that. And Professor Mugambi said something very, very important, explaining unity. But as you know, what has happened in the 60s, the first thing we have done all over Africa was to create one-party system and say we are one. It is why, the term unity, I run away from. Every time I hear it, I don't want to hear it. I want to hear pluralism.
Thank you very much, Professor Diop. Professor Mugambi, do you see any questions you would like to respond to? And let me just tell our audience, we will not get to all the questions, but we will try to summarize the written responses and share them with the audience later on. Professor Mugambi?
Yes, I just would want to follow up. Maybe Professor Diop was very articulate, and maybe if there are not many questions, it's because he's been so comprehensive in his response. I would like to put it this way, that this point that I have made about making a clear difference between uniformity and unity is extremely important, because it's very tempting in the pretense of presenting ourselves as united to mute the voices of those who otherwise would be most helpful. I think the history of our continent in the past 30, 40 years has been to fall into that mistake of muting and silencing the very voices that would have helped us. And it's for that reason that many of our brilliant minds have found themselves having to leave Africa in order to be able to express themselves. And it's a pity that this has had to happen, that the best of our brains have actually had to leave in order to be able to express themselves. My hope and wish would be that as we continue to reinvent our continent, that a difference is recognized as a strength rather than as a weakness. There's one author that I have a great respect for, and one of his books is The Dignity of Difference. And it does not help when we think that we are solving problems by silencing the people who otherwise would help us. And we have to find ways and means by which to take account and take seriously the voices of those who are in dissent, not by getting them out so that they can speak their voices from outside, but to find ways in which we can accommodate their opinions so that they are not neglected. And I think this is the greatest shortcoming in our context. In addition to this, one of my friends and colleagues I have respected for a very long time, the story of how we met is very interesting. And I will not say that now because you've given me permission. It's Mika Vahakangas, all the way from Finland. And thank you very much for the point that you have made, that even Europe gives a semblance of being united when they are outside, but they are not that united at home. Yes, this is one of the secrets of humankind, that we present a positive face when confronted with danger, but when we're at home, we fight. And I think it's a useful strategy because even in the wilderness, when animals of the same species are facing an enemy, they unite. But when they are alone, they are fighting. And this seems to be a strategy for survival. And we Africans have to learn that. When the West, the European Union, or any of those groupings come here, we get the impression as if they are united. But you get home and you see how fighting they are. This is how Homo sapiens have been created, but we haven't learned to ourselves enough to accommodate our differences for our own advancement for the future. I am hopeful that after this 100 years that we are about to celebrate, some of us will not be around in 2063, that we shall not continue to repeat the mistakes of the first centenary after 2063. And this is why I refer to those aspirations, because I took only one aspiration, the fifth aspiration. But when you take the total 7, they are trying to take cognizance of those differences that we must take account of in order for us to be able to move to the next level. So I want to thank President Diouf very much for that response and for the questions. And I long and hope for a time when we can have more Ngugi wa Thiong'os and more Okot Biteks and more of those authors from West Africa, because they are singled out there because of being the lone voices in their own countries for saying those things that those who are in leadership positions dare not say. But we have to create those spaces. The dignity of difference must be respected, move in the directions that I am hoping for.
And we are out of time, but let me just join everyone. I'm sure everybody from wherever you are in thanking Professor Mugambi and thanking Professor Diouf. We also thank you, our dear participants, audience, for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for the next lecture in this series, which will be in a week's time. You'll be receiving communication to that effect. Your questions, as I said, we didn't answer all of them, but we'll try to see if we can get Professor Mugambi and Professor Diouf to address them, and we can share them as we share the link of this webinar. So be on the lookout for the recording of this webinar. Please join us for the next one. And we are very delighted that you are here. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.